in Chicago on, it was shortly before this. So it was late September 2008. And so the financial crisis, the recession started back in like December 2007, but nobody really knew that we were in a crisis really until later on in the fall. So we were right on the cusp of this knowledge coming in about the financial crisis and some of the things that were going on, the bailing out of the banks and all of that stuff that you guys maybe have picked up here and there on the media and then also in the textbook. And so Michael Parkin, the author of your textbook, was at this conference, and he was presenting at a small little luncheon, and he was describing how the Federal Reserve's balance sheet had changed, and the bank was buying up what they called toxic assets. So imagine that we've got big banks failing. Why are they failing? Because people aren't paying back their loans, right? And so they have kind of a bad loan on their books. And one of the ways that the Federal Reserve provided liquidity to the markets is to actually take that loan off the bank's hands and take it inside. So it's kind of like buying a bond. You remember that exercise that hopefully got burned in your head? Imagine that Corbin here is holding, he's Wells Fargo or a big bank here. Wells Fargo didn't do too bad actually on holding bad loans, but some of those big banks, he's got an IOU from Joe Schmo, right? And it's a bad loan. It's kind of a toxic asset because the person who owes Corbin money is a loser, right? They're not going to pay it back. We have this financial crisis going on, and so one of the ways that the Fed helps support the monetary system was to go in and take that off the books of the bank. So now Corbin's got some money. And it was at a discount, by the way. I mean, it didn't get the full rate, but there was some sort of exchange of taking that off the books. And so Michael Parkin was explaining this at this luncheon. And at the time, again, this was all kind of new. And so afterwards, I emailed Michael Parkin this email. So this was dated October 2nd, 2008. Michael, one thing that stuck with me during your lunch talk was the change in the composition of the Fed's assets. I'm not that knowledgeable with the details of the Fed, but I would guess that they do not charge off bad assets very often, since they normally hold all U.S. government securities. With bad assets in the Fed portfolio, is the government potentially running the printing press, quote unquote, in a discreet way? This practice will definitely lead to paying for the bailout through higher prices as well as taxes, will it not? All right, so I was kind of using my stuff that I've been teaching in principles class with the quantity theory of money and thinking about what a little bit, I knew about banking and whatnot. So if Corbin holds on to this piece of junk, right, he will eventually just say, I'm charging off the debt. Right? These guys aren't going to pay, they went bankrupt, whatever. And then it's a loss on Corbin's books. Hopefully he builds that into his interest rates and whatever. That's part of the risk you take. But if it's in the Fed's hands, right? If the Fed is holding the note that is toxic, and this turns into a bad apple, a bad asset, what has effectively gone on with the transaction? Is that money ever coming back? In a normal sense, what would happen is that whoever owes that money, let's say they're not a total loser, and they pay a little bit of their money, they make a monthly payment back, that money comes back to the Federal Reserve, right? Kind of this system. Take that asset out of the economy, put in money short term, but during the duration of the loan, that money comes back to the Federal Reserve. But if this instead goes here, what happened to the money supply permanently? It went up. That money stays out in the system, right? So that's what I was trying to illustrate to Parkin here. Are they running the printing press? Is this like Zimbabwe and just running the printing press in kind of a discreet way because the general public doesn't have that depth of understanding of what could be possibly going on? So here is Parkin's response back to me. Russ, I enjoyed our conversations last week. I think we're heading towards the printing press. The Fed's balance sheet is in the table below. Between September 2007 and 2008, the monetary base, total liabilities, increased by 14%. Definitely inflationary if sustained. Look at the drop in safe government securities and the rise in loans to banks and other sometimes toxic securities, up from 30 billion to 446 billion. And the U.S. government securities down from 780 billion to 480 billion. Cheers, Michael. All right. So here's what he was saying is, here's what kind of the normal way was. The Federal Reserve, as we said, normally holds on to the Love Obama notes. Very safe. U.S. government's never defaulted on it, right? So for one of the first times in history, the Federal Reserve took in large quantities these toxic loans that some of them might get charged off, leaving that money supply out there potentially. And so you see the Federal Reserve notes, that's our currency. Bank deposits, U.S. government securities, big fall in that. Loans to other banks. So there was a big change in the in what happened here. So, being the little economist I am, I started thinking, well, that means inflation's coming. Milton Friedman said, if I increase the money supply in a big way, and I can't pull it back out because of toxic assets, we're going to have some inflation. So I thought, here in the next 1 to 2 years, I started telling people I think there's going to be inflation. Well, I've been dead wrong. Another common trait of economists that happens is that it hasn't happened yet. And one of the reasons it hasn't, that's a large contributing factor, is that people have been hoarding cash. Do you remember the currency drain? What did the currency drain mean? The currency drain, that was one of the things that changed the multiplier. When we looked at the deposit multiplier, that showed the maximum amount of times that money could be multiplied out into the system. But there was two things that kept it from reaching that potential. One was banks holding on to more money because their desired reserves were higher than what was required.
And then
what was
people
the other
also
thing?
not spending money.
People not spending money, people hoarding cash. And not only people, but corporations have been holding back cash and just stockpiling cash even through today. The behavior of businesses and consumers and households has really changed due to the financial crisis. And so there's large volumes of this cash that's being out there that Milton Friedman would have normally said is going to be inflationary. If they're not spending it, that doesn't happen, right? If you're just hoarding on to the cash, then we don't get the same effect. All right, questions or comments there? Got a couple more videos here to motivate this.
I like videos.
All right. So I think we'll do this is kind of the funny one first, and then we'll do the one that's a good video, but it's just a little more formal. Hi, Timmy. Treasury Department. Now Janet Yellen, but Ben Bernanke was the former one. So he handles the IOU Obama stuff, right?
Usually
in
make
reality,
animations
that's of course a bit of a spoof. Do those two get together and talk about that?
Probably not.
In theory, the Fed is independent of the Treasury Department, Obama and Tim Geithner, right? And so they're kind of doing their own thing. But implicitly, Geithner wasn't in any position not to do it, other than taking the huge cuts. That's part of the sequester. And do we cut government spending? If so, what do we cut? So those deficits were kind of inevitable. And I'd say it was more on Ben, who then has the ability to go to the bond market and buy those things up and do the process that we just showed by injecting money into the system. So I'd say it certainly falls on both, but I don't want to get into conspiracy theory stuff that they really meet like that at the table. That part of it was a bit of a spoof. All right, any questions or comments there? All right, this next piece is on showing quantitative easing, and so it's again similar to what's going on. This, however, was done from the Bank of England, and so we'll see how England has High Street instead of Wall Street, so their street is called High Street. It's kind of a similar thing. It's for the big banks, and you'll get the rest of it. They go through
Does
Main
every
Street.
country
So
have a street?
all of this is very
street.
similar to what went on in the United States of how quantitative easing works. All right, so just a 3-minute video here, well, almost 4.
Quantitative easing. How
She's
it
got a very
works.
pleasant voice.
The Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee has been purchasing assets financed by new money that the bank creates electronically. Often known as quantitative easing, this policy is designed to inject money directly into the economy. This is in response to a sharp fall in demand as businesses and consumers reduce their spending. In short, there's not enough money in the economy. The aim is to boost spending to keep inflation on track to meet the 2% target. Alongside its decisions on asset purchases, the Monetary Policy Committee continues to set bank rates each month. The bank purchases assets from private sector businesses, including insurance companies, pension funds, high street banks and non-financial firms. Most of the assets purchased are government bonds. There's a large market available, so the bank can buy substantial quantities of assets fairly quickly. The Bank of England's injection of money into the economy works through different channels and has a variety of potential effects. When the bank buys assets, this increases their price and so reduces their yield. That means the return on those assets falls. This encourages the sellers of assets to use the money they receive from the bank to switch into other financial assets, like company shares and bonds. As purchases of these other assets start to increase, their prices rise, which pushes down on yields generally. Lower yields reduce the cost of borrowing for businesses and households. This, in turn, leads to higher consumer spending and more investment. Of course, higher asset prices also make some people better off, which provides an extra boost to spending on goods and services. The Bank of England is also buying smaller amounts of private debt, like corporate bonds. These purchases are aimed at improving conditions in capital markets, making it easier for companies to raise money, which they can invest in their business. There's another way the bank's purchases of assets could put more money into the economy. Those selling assets to the Bank of England deposit more money into their bank accounts. So commercial banks have more funds which they can use to finance new loans. And more bank lending supports spending and investment. But this channel is likely to be relatively weak as banks continue to repair their finances in the wake of the crisis. That's why the Bank of England is buying most of the assets from firms other than banks. The extra money the Bank of England is injecting into the economy should increase spending to help keep inflation on track to meet the government's 2% target. Without that boost, the amount of money in the economy would be too low. Spending would be weaker and inflation might fall below target. But as perceptions of an improvement in the economy begin to spread, this will stimulate business and consumer confidence. That will help to underpin expectations the policy is beginning to work, which should itself encourage more spending and keep inflation in line with the target. As it sets policy each month, the Monetary Policy Committee will continue to be guided by the outlook for inflation relative to the 2% target. If the committee thinks inflation looks set to rise above target, it could raise bank rate and sell assets to remove the extra money it has put into the economy.
Doesn't she have a nice voice?
I wish I had a purple money bean.
All right.
Turn everything purple. Like that.
So, last comments or questions on some of that money stuff?
Well, so it was talking about how there's a target of 2%.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the benefit of having, like, what's the benefit of inflation, especially at like a 2% rate?
Well, that's arguable. The theory is that people would tend to freak out if prices are falling, and so to have a little bit of increase in prices is good for just business in general and to kind of keep things flowing.
People freak
But-
out with prices.
But there could be 0% inflation. From a real standpoint, money's kind of meaningless except as it facilitates trade. And so one of our policy goals that we haven't mentioned here for a little while, but let's list those up here. What were the 3 goals?
Or GDP.
Increasing GDP, so economic growth.
Unemployment.
Unemployment was, we want that high,
Is that third?
Low.
I'm guessing it's third.
0,
Oh.
around the natural rate, right?
Natural
So
rate.
basically in general, low unemployment, not low employment. Low unemployment, approximately the natural rate. And what was the last
I
one?
remember the third one.
The last one's the one we're talking about here. Yeah, inflation, what about it? What do we want with inflation? Do we want Zimbabwe?
No.
Okay, so what do we want with inflation?
We want steady. like-
Steady, so kind of low and stable is kind of the 2 generic words. Now those can be debated, what's low and stable, but stable is important for expectations that we'll we'll talk about more later. The low part has generally been agreed upon with 2 to 3%, and for kind of those reasons. The Bank of England has this target set up that's a little different than what our central bank is doing. They do more of interest rate targeting with the federal funds rate, and then hope to keep the inflation in that 2 to 3% range. So they don't come out and claim specifically that they're trying to keep it at 2. So the Bank of England is doing a little bit different policy measure, but those 2 things are closely related. Okay, good question. Anything else?
Will we eventually get rid of the penny?
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if somebody was going to bring up the penny. So what about the penny in the United States?
It costs more to make
Should
one.
we get rid of it? It costs more to mint than it's being used. That's been on the table. I'd say there's a real good chance in your guys' lifetime the penny will be eliminated.
What will happen to all
And
the
that's the
names
exact
now?
same thing of Zimbabwe, right? We go from the dollar to the, hopefully we won't jump that quickly,
What will
but
happen to the pennies that we already have? Like, I understand, like, they try to take them out, but like, in that transition, what would happen to the pennies that we already
they
have?
just start to become a collector item.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would assume, depending on who you're at, if somebody will take, if the general public will take 5 pennies instead of a nickel, then that'll continue to be used as currency, right?
We just won't-
It's not backed anyway, we learned, right?
Right.
So the coins and the currency is unbacked anyway.
So we'll just
So what
stop
makes it valuable is if somebody will take it.
Right.
So the phasing out would just be to discontinue its print, and then as they become lost or damaged, it's pretty hard to damage coins. That's one of the advantages of coins over dollars.
Would the government eventually just like start taking them in and breaking them down into the?
Nope, I don't think they'd even take them in.
Well, Because I know it's.
They would just quit producing them. Is what I think. I don't know that for sure, but
With currency, it's illegal to melt down currency, but then short.
yeah.
Besides government.
I don't think there'd be much reason to bring it in. If people want to continue using them, they can. If businesses start to phase them out on their own, people would start to collect them. You know that right away, right? I mean, if they stop all of a sudden, I'm going to keep all these pennies, and then everybody would have them in their house, and they wouldn't be out in circulation anyway. So that would be a likely result. So, okay. So chapter 9 is going to kind of continue a little bit on a money type theme, but we're going to look at other currencies around the world. So here's our big plate of spaghetti for starters, just to kind of catch our breath on how far we've come. We've come a long ways already, right? So we started off with the market system with no government and talked about the output market and the resource market as our two primary places. We got households owning all the resources and businesses producing final products, and then they engage in trade. Then we entered the government, talked about its flows and how it enters both marketplaces and influences them, especially we'll spend a lot more time on the tax issues. Then we developed a financial market that's global. We have households saving part of their money. We have businesses as the primary borrower of those funds. And so now we're going to look at a smaller subset of the financial market. So within that ring of the financial market, is the way I like to visualize it, we've got something like this going on. So this is on figure 2.9 if you've got your sheets available. Kind of motivates what's going on in the currency market in a little more detail that we didn't talk about before. So Americans have dollars. Chinese have the things we want, apparently, or a large part of the things we want. So the rest of the world has their own currency. They don't use dollars. Dollars are not money to them generally in their country. And so they send us over goods, which we call our imports. And so that transacts through the goods market. But before the money actually comes in, there's a swap here of yuan and dollars in what we call the foreign exchange market. So it's a separate supply and demand curve for just currency, right? Because we don't really, there's kind of a double whammy going on. There was this one where if we had a supply and demand for plastic toys, right? There's a supply of plastic toys from the Chinese supplier. There's a demand for plastic toys by the Americans. That's one supply and demand curve. But then there's another marketplace going on for the currency swap that needs to take place to facilitate that trade. And that's what we call the foreign exchange market. And of course, the same thing's going on for the chopsticks we're selling to China. We want dollars, we don't want yuan, and so there's the supply and demand going on the flip side of the transaction as well. All right, questions or comments on this little graph?
So
figure.
the foreign exchange market is powered by the fact that there are people with yuan that want dollars and people with dollars that essentially are wanting to purchase things with yuan.
Yep.
So what if the demand for foreign goods exceeds the foreign demand for dollars, so to speak, so that our purchasing power essentially doesn't, does that make sense what I'm asking?
We're gonna develop that.
Okay,
Yep,
all right.
that's part of what we're getting into. So glad to hear you chomping at the bit. So yes, we will look at stuff like that. So, and a lot of times people who hold currency, they might be holding both currencies. And so depending on what's happening in the currency market, you can turn a buck on the currency market too. If you think one currency is going to appreciate in value, then you can hold it just like you buy a car and hold it and hope that its value goes up. If it's a classic collector car or something, then you can hold yuan and hope that the value goes up and sell them at a later date. So it creates its own marketplace, thinking about them as assets. Okay, any other comments or questions on this graph? All right, let me put this away here. let's jump right into the market this time. So we're going to model that foreign exchange market with a supply and demand framework. So this is the foreign exchange market. And go ahead and just draw some good old demand and supply curve. And here we're going to measure the quantity of dollars. The quantity of dollars. And one thing to note is that this is the quantity of dollars for foreign exchange. We just got done talking about the quantity of dollars in the United States with the Federal Reserve putting the money in. We had Lewis buying something. We had, we went through that whole thing. That's not what this quantity is. This is the quantity of money that's out in the foreign exchange market, the smaller subset that's there to facilitate imports and exports. Okay? But it's still dollars at the end of the day, but it's dollars used for importing and exporting. Okay? So that's one little nuance to this that's a little different. And then on the vertical axis, we want to think about the price of money. And so that is going to be E. We're going to think about money a little differently in terms of how many, let's see, don't want to use, let's think about yen per dollar. So if I want to go out and buy $1, what's it going to cost me in terms of yen, in terms of another currency? So let's say that the initial equilibrium exchange rate, E1, is 100. 100 yen equals $1, ends up establishing the exchange rate. All right. Suppose that there's an increase in demand for dollars for some reason that we'll get into later. And I want you to draw a little dot right above here just for simplicity. And let's suppose that there's also a change in supply. So that we go from, maybe instead of calling that a prime, I'll call this D2 and S2, and these can be 1s. And now, the new exchange rate is 120. Did the dollar appreciate in value or depreciate? Depreciate?
It takes more yen per dollar.
So yes, it's more yen per dollar. So appreciation or depreciation? Appreciation. I hear some folks coming around here a little bit more, right? So $1 used to get me 100 yen. Now $1 gets me 120 yen. So I can buy more plastic stuff from China, right? So the dollar has appreciated in value. It's become more valuable under this setup, the way we have it drawn. All right, so let's call this point A and point B. We're going to write some of that out. So at point A, the exchange rate equals 100. Now I want you to use your notation a little bit differently. 100 yen per dollar. So I now put yen per dollar like that, and that's E1. E2 at point B, we have 120 yen per dollar. So E2 is greater than E1, implies that there was appreciation of the dollar. And the interpretation you can think about is that $1 gets you more yen. So the dollar has appreciated. Vice versa, of course, would be depreciation. All right, questions on that so far? All right, so we're going to jump right into some demand shifters. What causes the demand for dollars to move around? All right, number one, a change in the rest of the world's demand for U.S. exports. So you might recall import demand from chapter 15. So some of that chapter 15 stuff's going to kind of play into this because we're just now thinking about how the currency trades with that. So we derive the demand for imports. We also derive the export supply curve with that whole world market. That was the eyeball trick. So if the rest of the world has an increase in demand for U.S. exports, that is their demand for imports, right? So the rest of the world wants chopsticks made by U.S. companies. What do they need to buy American chopsticks? Dollars. So that'll lead to an increase in the demand for dollars. So that kind of follows suit, right? If they want more of our products, if there's an increase in the demand for the stuff we make, then there's going to be an increase in demand for dollars. All right, so an increase in the demand for U.S. goods which is the import demand for the foreign country. Remember this little notation? We're going to bring this back into play. So they want more of our stuff, so China wants to import our stuff, right? It's the foreign country's import demand. That little asterisk is our shorthand notation for the foreign country's import demand. An increase in demand for U.S. goods, or otherwise an increase in this import demand with the little star on it, leads to an increase in demand for dollars. And what does that do to the dollar? Does it appreciate or depreciate the dollar? It'll appreciate. So as we move from D1 to D2, we start to snake along this little guy with the exchange rate going up. So it leads to an increase in E, which is appreciation of the dollar. Okay, questions on that one? So that one's not too bad. It's a little bit difficult. It gets confusing as you're doing your reading and your homeworks. Just remember to keep track of who the foreign country is and who the domestic country is, because we've got those things going on. All right. Number 2 is a change in the U.S. interest rate differential. A change in the U.S. interest rate differential. If the U.S. has higher interest rates relative to their foreign counterparts, does the U.S. government bonds, the rate of return on those, look more attractive or less attractive to foreigners? If their interest rates are higher relative to other similar foreign counterparts, is that more attractive to investors or less? This is that interest rate thing. So I'm thinking from the buyer's side. When I buy that government bond, I want a high interest rate, right? So if U.S. assets look more attractive to foreign assets, they're going to need dollars to buy those, because Obama can't pay for weapons of mass destruction with yuan, right? He needs dollars, so they need dollars to buy those government bonds. I left that one blank. We'll pick up there and rehash that one on Friday. Remember, we don't have class on Wednesday.